Yat and welcome to our discussion panel today. Today, we are celebrating the second anniversary of the Navajo and Hopi families COVID-19 Relief Fund. It's been a long journey for our organization, and we've, in this time, partnered with a number of communities, leaders, and individuals. So as we've done that, we've been able to work with some of our council delegates, and we appreciate the partnerships that we've been able to have with our delegates in terms of providing services to their communities and their chapters. Now, I'd like to welcome our two guests today. And today we have Delegate Carl Slater and Delegate Vince James. And I'm going to go ahead and let the delegates introduce themselves. And we'll start with Delegate Vince James. Go ahead and introduce yourself, sir.
Yate, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vince James. Ado Todich evening sons na Jenny Bashes Chin, Kia Ani Dashachedo, Hanagani Dashanale, Ado look Antkilda in Ashako. Ado Banat Apan Stanigi, the chapters that I represent is Kendalachi, Ganado, Cornfield, Steamboat, and Jedito. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate James. And Delegate Slater, can you go ahead and introduce yourself, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Mahiro, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. Dona Nishanagi a Kiani She Sontone Bashachin, Sinajini Dashache, Do Sontone Dashanella, She Carl Russell Slater Dashajine, Senekana Dent Nasha. So I live in Round Rock. My name is Carl Slater. I'm Kiani, born for the Jewish people, and I represent Rock Point, Rough Rock, Lukachugai, and St. Louis Fields on the council, in addition to my home community of Round Rock. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. We do have a couple of other delegates that we've invited, and they might be joining us during this particular broadcast and this discussion panel. And if they do, we'll just go ahead and pick up with any of our questions and let them jump in and answer them. But what I wanted to kind of start off with is just to kind of set the stage for how the pandemic had impacted our Navajo Nation. So on March 18th, 2020, the Navajo Nation implemented a public health order that began to limit mass gatherings. And it was at this time that we started to, that we identified our first case of COVID, and that was the case that happened in Chilchimbito. On March 20th, this is 2 days later, we implemented a stay-at-home shelter-in-place order. And also on March 20th, we implemented curfews. Now, the pandemic really kind of impacted our nation in such a way that we had to respond to this. We had to protect our communities. On April 10th, 2020, we implemented weekend curfews due to community spread. And the COVID pandemic, the COVID virus was starting to spread throughout many of our chapters and communities. Now, by May 14th, 2020, the Navajo Nation was locking down for weekend curfews. And by this time, we were starting to really feel the impacts of COVID. And so as I have our delegates here, our delegates, our chapter and community leaders, and within their roles as leaders, there's an inherent responsibility to look out for and protect their communities and their constituencies. Some of the things that they need to do is to look ahead to make sure that they're making the best decisions that will benefit their communities. Now, as this pandemic hit, I'm sure it became more difficult to start to hold meetings. Many of our tribal departments were being shut down. Many of our hours were being reduced at some of the tribal divisions and departments that we look to for resources. Many of the meetings that we attend became virtual. So in that, setting the context for how the pandemic had hit our communities, I just kind of want to give our delegates the opportunity to express how the pandemic had affected the chapters that you had represented. And I'm just going to go in order again. So Delegate Vince James, can you speak to that a little bit, just how the pandemic affected the chapters you represent?
Thank you again, thank you for the question. In regards to how the pandemic affected my chapters was, it wasn't really serious from the beginning. I think it was just more of a caution at one point until one of our community, um, one of our community members, or one of our elders, he was the father, and he ended up getting flown out, and he passed away. And then 2 days after he passed away, his wife passed away. And then after his wife passed away, his child passed away 4 days later again. And so that really sent a message to the communities that I represent of how closely we are all related and how closely we know each other. And especially the two elderly couples were well known in majority of the communities that I represent. And so from there on, it just, once it hit the community and the news went out, I think it was pretty much like, okay, this is serious. This is some serious stuff. And so how it broke a family up and how those individuals were expressing to many different and other relatives throughout the community was just like, you guys need to take this serious, because I didn't get to say bye to my dad. I didn't get to say bye to my mom. I didn't get to say bye to my sibling. It was just a big shocking. And so from that point on, we took a lot of precaution at the chapter level to understand how it's going to affect all of our chapters. And we worked with CHR. CHR, they come back and inform us of how who the high risk individuals were at the chapter levels. And so we managed to move forward in that direction to make sure that we had some notice going on, and then to also send out some printed documents to those high risk individuals with CHR. And we went out and assisted with posting up some signs to those families and individuals that were at high risk under the listing of CHR. So that was how we started off, and that was one of our priorities, to get those sign out at their turnoff or in front of their home, to have that understanding. So it had really affected our 5 communities that I represent. And we just went in that directions with the Department of Emergency Management's orders and the guidelines that they have put in place for us as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Delegate James. We appreciate that insight into how the pandemic had affected your community. And also Delegate Carl Slater, maybe you can also weigh in on how the pandemic initially affected the chapters you represent.
Well, I think the immediate effects for my chapters and a lot of the nation related to, gatherings, and related to the workplace, and related to education. So our lives were immediately disrupted, right? There was no longer in-person instruction, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what that meant for the education of our children and how they would stay on track, how they would socialize, how they would get the tools and the setting to have a safe and healthy education and upbringing. And then on top of that, there was the whole childcare element. People relied upon the education system to provide childcare during the daytime. And that meant, people were working. But then you had folks who all of a sudden were out of a job. They were laid off because of the pandemic. So you had an immediate loss of income for a lot of families, plus childcare issues, because people, I think, were still going out and trying to find work if they could. And just absolute uncertainty. You had folks who didn't understand what this was going to turn into. None of us, I think, understood it at the outset. There are definitely people who said, "Oh, this is going to be a big deal." I remember, hearing that. But you can theoretically appreciate something and have not an inkling of what it actually feels like to be in the middle of the pandemic. And I'm very sympathetic to school board leadership, to my colleagues on the council, and to local chapter leaders who did everything they could to better position our communities and the safety of our people. But right at the outset, I think everybody was caught flat-footed, and that's not unique to Navajo or our communities. It was something that was pervasive from the top down, from the federal government and the president of the United States to, the junction between N12 and 191 here in Round Rock. So, that's just something I want to say, and I can definitely elaborate more on what I believe some of the failings were on the federal side that hurt us. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Slater. And just to reflect on what both of you had said, I mean, when the pandemic did hit the Navajo Nation, I think that you were right. We didn't know what to expect. As we watched the numbers start to increase in our border communities, in our border towns, it started to get very real in terms of how long it would be until we had a full-blown pandemic here on the Navajo Nation. As it did start to creep into our borders and start to affect our people, just as Delegate Vince James has said, in many ways, we were also caught off guard in terms of how fast it had affected some of the health of our elders. Now, as we have seen, the pandemic and COVID really affects the health of immunocompromised and elderly individuals. So as the pandemic started to infiltrate our communities, it really did. We started to see the loss of life. We started to see it affect our people who had health issues. Now, in this particular way, we also started to see that people had needs that weren't being served. As we started to implement some of these public health orders, they reduced the services that our communities depended on. And just as you guys are aware, our delegates here, a lot of our people go to the chapters, and they, that's where they are able to find out about what services are available, what's happening within their communities. And so as we started, it didn't immediately shut down chapters, but as we had moved along, a lot of people were kind of just left out in the cold, so to speak, to start to fend for themselves, to access some resources. So on that note, how were you able to serve the needs of your chapters during the pandemic? And I'll let either of you start first, whoever would like to answer.
Honorable Slater.
Thank you, Shisui. I guess to start off, I think there's a couple things. One is like immediate relief, and what is the definition of immediate relief? And then there's, I'd say, pandemic resilience and investments that you could make, as a nation and as maybe regional entities to support more resilience to the pandemic. So on an immediate side, I immediately convened my chapter leadership and others who were interested and said, look, they immediately started talking about what would eventually turn into the CARES Act, right? And I said, there's an opportunity for us to help define what that legislation would look like or how it's spent on Navajo. And I want us to get together and consider that and talk through things. And second, how can we organize among ourselves to support like mutual aid within our communities and to obtain resources from, you know, generous folks off the reservation or using our own chapter resources to obtain necessities. And so when I say necessities, I think prevailing theory for a lot of us was, how can you reduce the amount of potential exposure or the potential for exposure? And so that meant bringing what you need to stay alive to the community and to the home, and do them through distributions. And it's an interesting theory. It's a good one. And in that process, we learned, you know, or only highlighted the incredible amount of food insecurity. And, you know, we just need to say we have a lot of poverty in our communities, and it's about physical things. It's not about spirituality or anything like that. But from that side, you know, I'm just really proud. Our chapters were able to partner with Navajo Hopi COVID Relief Fund. We were able to partner with World Central Kitchen. And to that end, I think we were able to get, you know, every chapter doing a food distribution at least every other week. And I thought that was great. It didn't solve everything. And, you know, we had the first fatality from an IHS employee or staff member, you know, from our district. And I think that was just an extra gut punch. We knew that those people who are doing everything that they can to take care of us and keep us healthy, unfortunately, you know, they're gonna get exposed at times, and not everyone's gonna have the immune system to deal with that. So, you know, I think that was it, trying to demonstrate to your people that you're doing something, recognizing and validating their anxiety and uncertainty. There's no reason to BS people. You know, I think a lot of people think, oh, you know, we'll just stick together and get through this and blah, blah, blah. You know, a lot of us didn't know, and we can listen to science, we can listen to the medical professionals, but if you can just try to reduce the potential for exposure, that's what we were focusing on. And, you know, that related to propane giveaways and things like that. So I personally did a lot of fundraising for the district, and then worked with, you know, another nonprofit to help get those resources, you know, for propane distributions, we did some hay distributions, essential supplies, and tried to be a clearinghouse myself. But I'm only one person, so I had to rely on chapter staff, volunteers, and others to help get those out. And I'm really appreciative to the relief group and to the chapter staff. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Delegate Slater. Delegate James, maybe you can weigh in on that particular question too. So how are you able to how are you able to serve the needs of your chapters during the pandemic?
Thank you again for that question. The way I started off on to get the message out, and that was through providing information in our Navajo language on the radio, and assisting in that way, and using social media. I really didn't move to social media until we got wording, or until I got wording from our local hospital, Sage Memorial Hospital, that they had received the first case. And so I had to send out that message to Ganado and the surrounding area, and to my 5 chapters, that it had reached us and that it's currently in our community. And I had to make that message on social media to get that information out. And so my biggest worry was to get the information out, to make people know that, you know, I remember making my first message, and it was right at the end of the month, and then it was the beginning of the month, because we had elderlies, and they were getting their monthly check at the beginning of the month. And I remember trying my best to beg that, you know, nobody should be traveling, nobody should be going into Gallup, and making that assumption that, you know, that they're not able to catch this virus. And so it was a strong message that we went out and provided that information to my communities and to the Navajo Nation. And once we had an idea of what precautions to take, we then moved forward on addressing the needs of how we're going to help these individuals that are isolated, how we're going to help these families that are isolated and are under one roof. And so we moved in that direction. And so we came and we started working together. And from there, there were some other donation entities that we look forward to and that we asked assistance for. And of course, one of them was the Navajo COVID-19 relief. And that's how we ended up moving forward. And again, following the different guidelines of the different donation assistance programs, we move forward as with my team and community members to provide that service. And we did a lot to get a lot of these necessity items to the community members, and we went and also used our own personal vehicles to provide that needs that the people had applied for through the Navajo COVID-19 relief program, and then also then at the chapter level of what we received from different entities to provide those items to our people. And so we just worked as a team to move forward on striving to beat this virus and to accommodate as much as we can to eliminate a lot of that traveling and going out. And that's how we looked at other different entities that had donations to provide those items to us. So that's how we ended up moving forward and serving the 5 chapters that I represent. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate James. Appreciate that. And I'm gonna reflect back here to some of the to the last answer that Delegate Slater had given. And what I wanted to follow up on was I know that you said that you did have some opinions about how our federal government could have stepped up in a more beneficial way to help support our people during this time. So I was hoping that maybe you might be able to elaborate on that just a little bit.
You said initiatives, how our people stepped up, or examples of how our people stepped up?
No, just you had mentioned that that during the pandemic there were some failures of the federal government to step up and assist our people. And so I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of time to maybe express, because as the pandemic hit us, I mean, we did see that a lot of our needs went unmet. And even beyond that, the way that that we live in terms of there's so many disparities on the Navajo Nation and tribal nations when we look at outside communities, that during the pandemic, and this is just an example, you know, the CDC was saying, well, one of the best ways to help prevent the spread is to wash your hands. Some of our people aren't even able to just go and turn on a faucet because we don't have those kinds of infrastructure afforded to us. So in that manner, you know, how could the federal government have stepped up a little bit harder to help our people during this time?
Okay, well, we're all familiar with, you know, the historical inequities related to water, power, broadband, and though that trio, just its importance became so much more relevant during the pandemic. You had a lot more meetings occurring virtually, and finally a technology deployed across a lot of the United States, you know, the bandwidth on broadband that could facilitate the continuation of the economy and of school systems and other things, you know, not perfectly, but in a great way that never had existed before. You know, in a lot of our communities, okay, if you live close to the road or you live close to the intersection or whatever, you can get internet through NTUA or maybe Frontier or someone else. But if you live several miles off the road, if you live maybe close to the road, but just on the other side of the hill, that tower is not going to hit you. And it's very unlikely you're going to have fiber to your home or a DSL connection to your home. So, I think that there could have been a lot of efforts made by the government to address broadband connectivity on the reservation at the outset. And that could have been the investment into satellite internet services for every household that had a child in an educational institution. It also could have been the provisioning of those things to the students of, like, say, a Diné college or an NTU. So those are one thing on the communication side. On the running water side, they gave us $714 million in the CARES Act, and they said, okay, well, you have to spend all this money by the end of December. And everybody knew that the pandemic was not going to be over by the end of December 2020. So it created, I'd say, an artificial sense of urgency that didn't necessarily need to be there. There was urgency in addressing a lot of these needs. But let's talk about water. Okay, we have tons of people in my district and in Delegate James' district who haul water, and that's a fundamental inequity to someone who lives in Holbrook or Flagstaff or whatever. But the government could have allocated resources to do a water hauling service or to drill some new wells during the pandemic to maybe shorten the distance that people had to go in order to do that, reduce the cost, particularly when your pocketbook was tightened. But we, I think, have like $3 billion in water needs on Navajo at least. And $714 million isn't going to solve that. That wasn't going to take care of all of it. And that doesn't even go to addressing power. And I think it's about $1.5 billion maybe in power needs on Navajo. So the $714 million wasn't going to take care of our basic infrastructure. If it's not going to take care of the basic infrastructure, then maybe you could design some programs or projects that could help people. And we don't have a highly funded Department of Health, which was tasked with overseeing, the pandemic response. So again, what is $714 million going to do when you're balancing every single one of these things? And in addition to that, you're trying to provide some economic certainty, some household fiscal certainty to our citizens. And I was proud to, introduce that hardship assistance program under the CARES Act. And I really appreciated Delegate James getting out there, sharing information in our language so that everybody understood what it was and that they could potentially qualify. But, the federal government, like governments all across Western Europe and the rest of the world, they were printing money and providing assistance to people, on a biweekly or a monthly basis to sort of provide a minimum bare income for people to deal with the pandemic. And what did our government do? It gave us, is it $600? I can't even remember now at this point. But the summer of 2020, they gave us, a check. And then I think there was a follow-up later, another 6 months later, something like that. And it was a pittance compared to what other governments were providing to their people. We live in the richest nation in world history, just the richest nation in world history. There is the money out there, as crazy as this artificial concept is, to help our people. And if you don't want to do it from the financial side to get more money in our people's pockets and keep them alive that way, you could do it in the program side, like having water delivery services, well drilling programs. You could have immediately authorized, funding to take care of the SDS listing, the IHS, sanitation deficiency listing. But they didn't do any of those things until the ARPA, legislation was, or sorry, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act legislation was passed. So I think those are some of the things that the federal government had an obligation as our trustee and under the Treaty of 1868 that they failed to provide. I think the nation has like maybe $3 billion in all of the, the trust funds or something like that. we got about 2 billion in the ARPA. Remember, you know, we just fundamentally don't have a lot of money as a nation to provide the ongoing support that was required by the pandemic. And that falls back on the federal government and their trust responsibility to backfill or stopgap, you know, those services. So thanks, Mahar.
Awesome. Thank you, Delegate Slater. Delegate James, just kind of along the same lines, how did the lack of infrastructure, just in terms of even roads, access to water and broadband, how did you see that impacting your community during the pandemic and even now?
Thank you for the question again. It has really impacted those families that don't have access to the broadband, water, and power. It has really affected them. And each of my chapters, there are several families that don't even have access to all three of them. And when you start reviewing those kind of listing, it's bothering some to know that we have now for families out there that are living in this condition. And out of those individuals, there are some individuals or families that don't even have a permanent structure in place, and their living condition is more of an outcome of a tent or a shack. And so those were the kinds of families that we also concentrated on and providing service to. And it's just in the matter of where these families come from, their history, how they struggled, and how they were unable to get homes in the border town areas, or due to the lack of their background issues, they were unable to obtain a home under the Navajo Housing Authority. So those were the kinds of individuals and families that we assisted as well. And I don't know if you recall one of our meetings, Nabik meetings, I have brought up these concerns and bringing these issues and highlighting it to the Navajo Nation President's Office. And we did our best to assist those families and provide some sort of materials to at least get them into a small permanent structure home. And I want to thank the division directors that assisted myself and then these families in each of my communities. But in reality, they still did not have the water line or the power line or the broadband. And so we still moved forward by providing gallons of water, or even working with others that provided wash stations. They had little washing stations that they gave us to provide to those families, and that did not have that option to turn on the knob to wash their hand. And so that was one of the other areas. And the other area was providing the different sanitize, the different size of sanitize to them, and also the wipes to address the issue of telling them, you know, everything that's touched or that you touch, just make sure you wipe them down, you clean your hands, use these sanitizers, because you don't have running water. And at one point, we also worked with NTUA to provide those hotspots to those families and to get those hotspots. But it worked for a little while, but they started having issues with it downloading certain images, certain files. They started having that issue. So we really couldn't do anything at the same time regarding broadband for some of our kids that were living out there, or that were in this condition that I talked about earlier. So it really was an honor to also get in touch with the water warriors, and using that organization to haul waters to these homes that actually needed running water, that did not have access to running water. And that was a great team to utilize as well. And we went out there, we had a couple individuals that hauled the main water, and they would just be parked at a central location. That way they're not hauling a 500-gallon tank or a 1,000-gallon tank to each home. But then we used our own individual vehicles that were 200 gallons, or the 50-gallon barrels. There'll be 5 or 6 of them in the truck, making those deliveries in each of the areas that we designated to address with the water assistant. And so that's how we did our part. The other part was the power. There was certain families, we really did not get any solar panels or battery assistant out there, but I know there was 2 families that were assisted with that solar system in place. And that was when we found out that, they needed some sort of, at least a power source to utilize the oxygen that they had brought back from the hospital. And that was, from my point of view, I know we only assisted 2 individuals in that scenario out of the families that didn't have power line or electricity access. So that's how we ended up working with the NTUA. And then we also got assistance from an organization called Helping Hands in Phoenix. And so that's how we ended up assisting those 2 families that came home with having to utilize oxygen. So that would be my response. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you, Delegate James. And Delegate Slater had limited time to join us today, so he had to jump off the call. But I just kind of want to give a couple more reflections, and we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll probably wrap this up. But one of the things that I wanted to just discuss briefly is that as the pandemic had affected our communities, and as our services had gone into shutdown in terms of like our schools, some tribal services, we all had to adapt to working from home, to having our kids participate in school by online learning. And however, it did seem to teach us that we are able to do these things. We are able to exist, and maybe not in the best way, but we were able to continue on in education by having our kids come home and go to school from home. We were able to continue to have even chapter agency meetings, or agency chapter meetings, chapter meetings, and council meetings virtually. Business had to move forward. Our legislations had to move forward, which I think is important. We had to adapt, and even as Navajo people, as Dene, we are able to adapt to many things. We're very resilient. So just kind of in looking at how the pandemic had affected us in those ways, what were some of the things that you kind of took from that, just in terms of like learning how we had to, how we had to adapt, and how we were able to adapt, and how we were able to continue doing our jobs? I mean, as you look at what it is that you had to do, what were some lessons that you learned from the pandemic?
thank you again for that question. I did learn a lot from this pandemic, and I learned that we can adapt and accept changes, and it's just in the matter of giving it time to accept those changes. And when I say changes, it's what you explained earlier, meaning that a lot of our kids were doing a lot of online schooling, and then we were, as leaders, we were also doing a lot of stay at home, teleconferencing, and virtual um, um, meetings that we took place, and then how the school did a lot of the virtual graduation that took place, and knowing and accepting those changes and adapting to it was something interesting to see. And I think it was one of the best learning experience that I learned, to see that, you know, my people, our Navajo relatives, our Navajo families are capable and able to adapt to changes. I know that a lot of our elderlies did not like that. I had several elderlies just like calling and crying, and they're just like, you know, it's hard. The elders were saying, you know, I grew up going to people's home and sitting down and talking and having that laughter, and I can't do that. I've been doing just staying home for the past 8 9 months, and it's hard, it's frustrating. And when we were doing deliveries out there to these individuals' homes, families would come out, and elderlies would come out, and they would say, "Delain hipesh ma saan it," and some of the elderlies were crying, and it's like they wanted to hug me and I wanted to hug them, but we just couldn't. And they're just standing there talking to me in Navajo and saying, you know, it's really hard. It's really depressing. They were saying in Navajo, just staying home and not seeing anybody. And I'm glad that you stopped by as our delegate, and I'm glad that you brought these items. I don't know who the rest of the individuals are here, but I want to thank you guys all, is how they were expressing their feelings, and how they were so appreciative of what we were doing our best to provide that service and to address those needs of our elderlies and our disabled families, and families that were really affected from this whole pandemic. So it was a learning lesson. It's just in the matter of understanding where to have that precaution and working with those individuals. And for me, it was more of having that team. It took a team effort to go out there and assist each of the communities. And it was tough at times. I know I have some chapter officials that have disability issues, and their immune systems are not that strong and so forth, and we had to understand that as well, but somehow they still assisted in some way. And I want to thank them as well, my chapter officials, for doing their best, and then my chapter administration staff for all the 5 chapters that I represent. And it was a learning experience, and then at the same time, um, knowing that as us leaders, we can adapt to these changes and accept these changes, that really reduce a lot of the travel cost savings for the nation. Understanding that we did a lot of the virtual meetings, the call-in meetings, the teleconference, it was something that was very interesting to see in our budget as well, to know that, you know, hey, we save this much money for the Navajo people. And it's just like we should somehow move in that direction to address a lot of these needs that need to be taken care of throughout the whole reservation, by doing a lot of the virtual and teleconferencing um, meetings that how we've been moving forward and how we've been doing our business lately. So, very interesting experience. Thank you. I think you're muted. I can't hear anything.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Delegate James. I wanted to just thank you for being a part of our discussion today. And thank you for dedicating your time and effort to helping your communities during the pandemic, and also for networking and partnering with us to be able to provide resources to your community. So with that, we're at the end of our hour, and I'm going to go ahead and end this session. But thanks, Delegate James. We'll talk again, okay? Okay. All right. We'll talk.
Oh, thank
soon.
you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, and God bless the Navajo Nation in Chicago. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.